Hey, hello everyone. I'm going to set my timer. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Great presentations, I thought, at the beginning of the session. Just to confirm, not dissimilar to Sarah, actually, whose talk I really enjoyed, I'm also kind of in between two worlds. I was going to do some performance art. This one leg is stuck in kind of traditional world, and then things like crypto and machine learning keep pulling me in this direction, but sadly this leg is rather slow on the uptake. Just to confirm, coming into spaces like this, I cannot stress enough how much more ideas and energy there are here than any other world, and I'm very grateful for that. I named this talk Protocol Art, largely because that's the framing that my partner Holly and I have been using for the art we've made for the best part of a decade. And just to give a little bit of definition to that, which is pretty commensurate, I think, with what people were talking about in the first session, is just this idea of where does the art live? And so for us, protocol art basically means art upstream of the production of media, right? Like, so most people's interpretation of art is the media, right? Like a piece of music, a picture. But I think one of the reasons I was drawn to crypto initially, and increasingly machine learning, is that so much more of the interesting activity happens kind of upstream of that, right? Like at the protocol level, whether you're talking about crypto works, NFTs, and really came to this observation living in the Bay Area 10 or so years ago during kind of the platform boom, and realizing that there were kind of invisible developers working at a low level, ostensibly making creative decisions that would ostensibly kind of produce media downstream of them, right? So if some developer at Instagram determines that everyone needs to be making video, all of a sudden a bunch of video is made, right? And so if you start thinking about permission systems or the environments in which media is consumed and produced right now, you really do have to start thinking lower level or upstream of the production of media. Long story short. So anyway, I thought this was actually really cool. I took a picture in the bathroom earlier. I promised that my zipper was done when I took this. I thought the sticker was incredible, right? Bitcoin applied anarchism. I actually really relate to that sentiment, particularly speaking again about protocol art, right? This idea, one of the first reasons I was initially drawn or kind of my interest was piqued in Ethereum was this idea of making critique executable, right? Like, which adds a whole new demand on the artist or on anybody really to say, okay, I have this cool idea about what I'd like to see in the world. Okay, now with these primitives, I can kind of speed run that idea actually in the world. I can test it. I don't just want to write a book about it and expect someone else to pick it up. And so ultimately it comes down to this idea of agency, right? Like, how much agency you have to build an economy around your work, have your work, do things in the world. That's what we're particularly interested in. So because I'm short on time, I'm going to skip through some of these. This was a really old project that I did. Holly and I have a background in music. We've released records that are very much along this theme. We put out a record called Platform in 2015, where we started building a lot of kind of platform tools, and a record called Proto in 2019, which is kind of the summary of a bunch of work we've been doing in machine learning from around 2017 or so. And so our approach towards machine learning ultimately was we started training models around 2016, 2017, and it became really clear that the data question was going to become massive, right? The first question you have to ask to yourself when you're training a model is, what am I going to train it on? And we're like, okay, well, that's going to be a big deal, right? So we chose at that particular point in time to deliberately produce training data to be able to produce bespoke models. And so, for example, this is from a performance we did touring this record, Proto, which is a live training performance where we invited, I think over the course of the tour, like it was well into the six figures of people to consensually contribute their voice to a model we're training. I'll play like a second of it. Oh no, that video's not playing. Never mind, that was just a picture. Sticking to this theme, around about 2021, we put out a project called Holly Plus, which I think is kind of somewhat symbolic of this protocol art approach, where we were thinking, okay, so now the tools exist to be able to spawn or kind of recreate someone's identity using neural networks, machine learning tools. Wouldn't it be kind of cool to put together a protocol of permissions around Holly's identity, ostensibly decentralizing her identity? So we put together this site, holly.plus. You can use it today, even though the models sound rather dated, where anybody could upload audio and receive audio in return with Holly's voice. We then built on-chain a kind of protocol for governance of this identity, right? So you had an NFT voice model. I believe that was probably the first AI model sold as an artwork, at least on chain. And a DAO that basically would approve derivative works made with her voice, and a profit split mechanism. So basically you make a song with Holly, with a decentralized version of Holly, an artwork is sold, 50% of those proceeds go to the person who used her identity, 40% goes back to the DAO to incentivize further development of the models, and 10% goes back to Holly herself for the IP. And we, as part of this process, we developed singing models. We also developed a real-time singing model. I hope this video plays, that we showed at TED the next year. Oh, yeah.
And with this microphone, you'll hear a live version of Holly Plush developed with Voctor Labs.
So anyway, so working quite closely with machine learning, the whole idea is that, we kind of are a thesis-driven art project, which is kind of strange, but we start thinking, okay, we're interested in machine learning. How can we break this? How can we kind of assert some agency over these tools and maybe come up with our own way of working with it? One of the great benefits to this, I only bring this up because the work was being shown on the screen over here, is that once you actually start messing around with these tools, you kind of end up coming up with something new. I'm quite proud, particularly in this context, to say that I think this was the first text-to-video art ever, period. And it was all on chain in 2021. There's a piece called Crossing the Interface that we did. And I know it was the first because we had to take an image model and then write scripts to be able to chain those images together in sequence, which is how you get, obviously, animation.
It simulates a state of constant virtual wakefulness.
I'm going to keep going. So I'm actually going to skip through a lot of this because I planned for a much longer talk. These are some projects. This is a project we showed at the Whitney Biennial last year where we're basically trying to manipulate Holly's embedding or concept in public models. By taking a bunch of pictures of her, taking a bunch of pictures of her in a new costume, doing something we refer to as cliche poisoning. Long story short, you don't have very much agency over your identity in a public model, right? Because there's been so much emphasis on truth in the model, it actually kind of fixes your identity in place, which is very kind of, what's the word? Very kind of contradictory to the original premise of the internet, right? The whole promise of the internet was pseudonymity, anonymity. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. But in the context of AI, with such an emphasis on truth, it's kind of like saying, well, actually, do you get to control who you are on promptable public models? And so this is an idea we had to try and change that, ultimately transforming Holly's embedding from a woman with red hair into a kind of superhero with red hair. And it's kind of funny, if you actually do want to play with this model, there's I think tens of thousands of images now at xharrymutantx.whitney.org where people can interact with this model, which I think is quite interesting, largely because it's also taking advantage of the native permissions and kind of affordances of this new format, right? Like making an AI model now, particularly if you put your hands deep into every stage of the process, which I'll go and talk about later, is actually a new medium for art. And it's an unusual medium, right? Because models, people want to play with them. And so in essence, through this project, our ultimate opinion or thesis is that the pictures that are produced by this model will go on to change Holly's identity in future models. But in the short term, incidentally, it produces a lot of media, right? A lot of pictures that are somewhat infected by this new kind of costumed Holly. So this brings us up to like two projects that are a bit more present at the moment. We have this book coming out in the next couple of weeks called All Media is Training Data, which is a bit of a preamble towards the project, the exhibition that I'll talk about. And so just to reiterate, it's kind of our position that now that everything you produce, we now know has this new dimension of being training data. Our position is that we, one, have to kind of digest that, whether it's on an industrial level or an artistic level, and so we have to take part in the deliberate training of these models, right? Deliberately producing training data, understanding that what we're doing is going to be sent into the future and will be infinitely spawnable or infinitely kind of remixable or whatnot. And so taking this spirit, we have an exhibition at Serpentine Gallery in London at the moment that's up until February that we called The Call. So to explain The Call, it'll take me a lot longer, but But basically, the idea was to run people through every step of the training of a deliberate AI model with a deliberate thesis and a deliberate outcome. So, just to reiterate, everything from the data collection process to the data labeling process to the model training itself and to the ways in which the models are interacted with is something that we creatively intervened in, which is a bellyache. Took a hell of a lot of time, but ultimately, I'm quite surprised it all worked out. And so our idea was that we would produce a songbook that was deliberately designed for the production of training data. What I mean by that is that if you sing every song in the book, you'll cover the full range of the full phonetic range of the English language, sufficient that if you sing all the songs in the book, the models will be able to perfectly interpret your voice. We took this book to 15 locations across the UK, kind of like an ethnographic tour. Over a number of months. And here's one of the songs.
Take your time, don't rush. Okay, rush, it's good. Thank you.
This is from Carnoustie in Scotland. You get the idea. Right, so that training data, there's a couple of opinionated ways in which we dealt with it, right? So the 15 choirs joined what we describe as kind of a new IP primitive. We're calling it a data trust right now, but if you're going to be a stickler, it's not actually going to be a trust, because it turns out trusts don't work in this context. Still, there is like a cooperative that's been formed, so all of the different choirs own their voices and get to govern where that data will go in future. We negotiated with them to be able to use it to train these models. One of the models lives inside this rather crazy organ object that we built for the exhibition. And all of that data was then used and synthesized with our own archive of recordings from like 15 years to produce a new diffusion audio model we call linked diffusion, which is basically like the hybrid of all of these different voices from out the UK and us. And I'm going to play a couple of songs from the model because I'm just kind of proud of them because the model rips. It's really good. I'm going to play another one. So this model essentially produces emergent new 3.5-minute songs. Another kind of fun side of it is that because it's a diffusion model, you can take one channel of outputs, feed it back to the model, and then you will get ostensibly produce people, right? Because you then get all of the different choirs harmonizing with that original model. So it's kind of like a multi-channel diffusion model when you actually go in the space. I love this one in particular. So one of the ideas we're exploring with this show, which is rather, I'll explain why in a little bit, and I think speaks a little bit to what Achilles was talking about earlier, related to kind of sacred objects. There's this rather antiquated idea of the public domain that becomes really kind of relevant when we start thinking about AI, particularly about like who owns AI, right? Like what data goes into these models. There's of course large debates on Twitter that I get embroiled in, related to the provenance of that data. You know, who owns it, who should own the output, so on and so forth. And what we want to try and revive with the show, which does I think speak to a degree of protocol in the sense of something a little bit more cosmic or spiritual, is this idea of contributing to an AI model deliberately as a kind of submission to something greater than the sum of its parts, right? Which is, in relation to the arts generally, or culture more generally, I think is a very beautiful idea that ought to be revived, particularly when people bring up notions of copyright and kind of ownership, which are important. And so one of the ideas we've been talking about is kind of reviving this idea of a sacred public domain. Public domain is kind of antiquated in a sense because, for those old enough to remember Flickr and blogging, it was kind of like a big thing. And then in the intervening years, with the exception of on-chain works, where public goods are considered kind of sacred in their own right, we contribute all our data to Instagram and Twitter and so on and so forth. The public domain doesn't really exist in those contexts. And so we're trying to bring it back a little bit. This is something very different. This was a fun experiment. About a year ago, we stopped all image training in the world for 2 5-minute periods, testing a network as an art project, which is something I don't have enough time to go into. But recently we put out, with some collaborators, we have an organization called Spawning, with the explicit goal of producing public domain AI, so public AI. And a couple of weeks ago, we put out this dataset, PD12M, which is like a very highly curated, very high quality, the largest public domain image dataset that's kind of sufficient to produce a base foundation model that would be owned by nobody and available to everybody. And the good news is we've already started training it. So we basically took PD12M, those 12 million images, did a bunch of tricks to turn them into PD like 50M, and started training a new base foundation model with this idea in play of saying, well, again, if you wanted executable critique, or if you're thinking about the future of machine learning being like a privatized thing owned by a few people and determined by a few people, actually a really beautiful kind of applied gesture in this context would be to just train a model that's owned by nobody. That's really good. And we think actually it's going to be about 75% the quality of the state of the art, which isn't, it's not 100%, but it's pretty damn close, particularly for people to use. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is that, somewhat ironically, having a model that nobody owns also opens up the question or the potential for actually ownable AI models, which I don't have a lot of time to go into, but I think in the context of crypto, it's really that beautiful balance of, NFT people are very, very happy. There's this huge embrace of CC0, of nobody owning anything, and yet ownership being fully enabled by these primitives like NFTs, being really happy that the media is available for anybody to remix and anybody to permissionlessly kind of work with, and also having a scarce ownership model. And so our contribution here, we'll at least see with Public Diffusion, which should be out soon, is a way of maybe throwing that dynamic into the AI space. Yeah, so I'm done. I hope I wasn't too fast and I kind of jumped through a bunch of stuff, but very, very happy to be here. And please, I'd love to take any questions.
Timing was perfect.
Yeah,
Timing was perfect. Thank you so much, Matt. So, are there questions for Matt? Viet.
Thank you so much for the presentation. A lot of cores, they were amazing, even in 5 seconds. First, quoting you here when you said made available for everyone. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the user experience, how it can look like?
For Public Diffusion?
Yeah. I'm just curious. For example, imagine we're walking into this museum and we see this presentation. How does it look like? The engagement part.
Yes, well, so Public Diffusion will be an open weights model like Stable Diffusion or Flux that anybody can use. We'll upload it to Hugging Face. And so, yeah, I mean, for people to actually interact with it, I mean, there's a number of people I've spoken to here tonight that are familiar with running their own models at home and being able to make art with them. Work pretty much like that. But the idea is it would be completely unconditional. It's kind of a gift to the world, right? Like, there's going to be an open weights model that's really performant, that you can fine tune to make art with or make a business with, whatever you want to do. But it's kind of, again, going back to this very beautiful idea of there being a model that's owned by nobody, that's available for anybody to experiment with. That's the goal.
Any other questions? Oh, Anna, let me pass through the mic. Can you pass?
Sure. I really like the idea of the public model. The first question is, what would you need to go from the 75% to being as good as the state of the art? And if that means that you actually need more training data, would there also be something available where you as an artist or creator can say, like, look, I will contribute my data?
Absolutely. There's a mechanism for you to do that. There's a site we built called source.plus where you can do that currently. But that's exactly the point. It's actually trying to incentivize or make people fall in love with the idea of public domain again. I also do have an idea I'm not going to talk about to try and bridge that delta, because it's a bit longer and it's a bit kind of it's a bit more like incentive games. But I think that, to your point, I mean, I quite like that idea of a target of saying, okay, we can get to 75% quality. How do we get like an extra 30%? Like the math doesn't work on that, but you know what I mean? How do you take this over the edge and make people fall in love with the idea that it will be owned by everybody and nobody at the same time? But yeah, bridging that data delta is significant, but not insurmountable. Yeah.
So when LLMs came out, I think there were a few people that reproduced a render function in Doom that was able to, like, I think it was a fast Fourier transform optimization used in Doom, and basically they were able to like get ChatGPT 3 or 4 to like reproduce that, and I think that code was licensed as like GPL code, I think, or whatever. Like, anyways, that code shouldn't have been used to train an LLM, right? So, and so this serves, I think, among other artifacts, kind of as proof that I think some of the big players, they're just like scraping all of the data and just using it for, to train privately their models. I think also this woman, Mira, I forget the
Murati.
name. Yeah, she was also saying something like that in an interview, right? So if we frame this kind of as a fight between the commons versus people that are privately just like taking all of the data, I often wonder, what you are doing, I think what the decentralized social networks are doing, it's like a good effort, right? Like, we're all trying to build out the commons and whatever, but on the other side, our data is also available to those who are stealing and privately training their models. So how can we ever win?
It's a good point. I think there's two sides, right? Like, ultimately, the highest likelihood is we don't. So you have to factor that, right? If you want to compete, my argument, which is maybe orthogonal to an art question, is you win on like inference costs. So if anyone's using like GPT-4o or whatever, and you see every time it's reasoning, those are all tokens that hypothetically someone's paying for on an API, and it's very costly. You don't need a Nobel laureate level reasoning to do most things that most people or businesses are doing. And so actually having open models that are available will be really cost effective for people. And I think that's maybe how you win in some domains. But ultimately, like, this speaks to the bigger point of like, you know, one of the beautiful things about the Ethereum community, for example, and like the general idea of public goods and decentralization, which were some of the original principles that got me interested in these networks, is this idea that, okay, we might not win, but you could also just have an entirely parallel ecosystem that does really well. You know, so yeah, I think feeding that spirit is a good in and of itself, even though I'm not under any false pretenses about the kind of resource delta between what we're doing and Google or something like this. But I think that's where the moral argument comes in, more so even than the question about training data, is this idea of, do you want for everybody to have to pay a tax to Microsoft in order to pursue very performant AI models? And I don't think that that's necessary. I think we can do a lot better in a decentralized fashion.
Awesome. Any other questions for Matt? There's one more.
I guess this is maybe you can just tell me if I should ask you this after.
Sure.
Because it's not directly related. But the work that you're talking about here is all oriented around. I mean, one way of the different meanings that ownership has or will have. Mm-hmm. And the overall piece is described as protocols. Like that is overwork. But also you guys have done, you and Holly have done tokenized works,
yes.
Visual works. How do you think of the relationship of those and what they mean for ownership or why they should exist, I guess?
It's a great question. I wish I'd put that in the presentation because you're right. We've been dealing with ownership or the stickiness of ownership for a long time. It's like something I'm actually fascinated by. The thing I love NFTs, partly for the reason that I see in their best instantiation, their positive sum, right? It's this idea, again, I think I said this earlier, of saying you submit a gesture to the world, it is available to everybody. We operate permissionlessly. I'm happy for our work to be used, which is kind of confounding to some people, given the amount of time we spent thinking about training data and how pissed off people get about it. But this idea, it's kind of a miracle that a new primitive was invented to create scarce value on top of media that is abundant, right? That is brilliant, and it's also, people have a really hard time getting their head around it because they're like, well, wait, no, like I'm used to a format. This is a really roundabout thing and I'm probably going over, but there's an art historian called Abby Warburg. For anyone going through London, there's a school called SOAS. You need to go to the Abby Warburg archive. Long story short, Abby Warburg was this kind of parallel history of kind of art history. He wasn't particularly interested in owning things. He wasn't interested in biography. He wasn't interested in provenance in the classic sense of, Picasso painted this at a particular day. He was interested in the metadata. So he has this wild archive of different cultures producing art from all different times. And when you go there, the archive's all photocopies, right? And so it's this whole parallel art historical thing where the value, the scarce value was in the ideas, it was in the culture, and the media itself is fungible, right? The media just is this abundant thing. And I very much relate to that. And I feel like almost, the brilliance of a lot of people working in decentralized networks, whether it be crypto or otherwise, is that intuitively I feel like everybody kind of works in that way. It feels arresting when someone's like, I put an NFT project out, you can't take my picture. You're like, wait, you don't get it. Like you're coming at this with exactly the wrong way. And I think that balance between ownership, like scarce kind of money games, and just abundant media is very future-proofed, particularly when we start talking about this kind of paradigm of AI models where ostensibly media is just abundant. You can print infinite images from these models, but it's the scarce relations, it's the context around individual pieces of art that's the source of value. And I think that it's just a brilliant idea I wish I came up with. Yeah.
All right, so is there one last question for Matt? There's one here.
I don't know how much it's relevant, but in the first slide, there was an NFT, and then it's like, in my imagination, that the NFT is what makes none of this one. No. Yeah, this one, exactly.
Yeah.
So the voice model is the NFT itself, and
Yes.
I need to get the audio through the NFT or something like that?
No, actually, the NFT is held in a wallet by the DAO. And the NFT was kind of a symbolic collection object, so you collect the model of the voice from back then, but the voice is publicly available for anybody to use. And so the whole idea there was, would people collect an AI model back in 2021, and be able to show off and be happy that they own this thing that is being used by everybody. I mean, it's funny, and it kind of worked, the experiment. Actually, the last Berlinale, there were 3 films using Holly Plus that didn't ask our permission. And they only told us afterwards. They invited us to the opening, and we're like, cool, that's great. That's a perfect example of the principle at work.
And if they don't use it, then you have all the 50%, 40, 10%?
Yeah, well, this is voluntary.
All right.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matt. That was really amazing.
Thank you.
Give it up for him.